Eat or be eaten, I guess. Olivie Blake has legitimately outdone herself. I previously understood this to be an impossible feat. This book's themes are societal expectations for women, the loneliness of women, the love of women, to be the object of affection of a woman, to be the object of desire of a woman, the cost of success, achievement, motherhood, and power, all wrapped up in Blake's sharp wit, gorgeous prose, and sardonic humor. Our two main characters are Sloane, or Dr. Hartley, and Nina Carr. Sloane is a sociologist, and she's married to Max, who's also a university professor. So Sloane is a mom. She's re-entering the workforce after a year and a half of being a full-time mom to her child, Isla, her and Max's child, Isla. Anyway, Dr. Hartley, Sloane, is a published author, and she was previously very esteemed at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, or the class college that she was at, before her and her husband Max moved to the university. Her husband Max has now been selected for tenure track at the university, and a few things have led to a pretty extreme shift in their marital dynamic. One being that Sloane was previously very respected at their collective school, two being that they now have a child between the two of them, a dependent that's really rearranged or shifted their life priorities, and three, the reason that Sloane has been hired at all at the university is she's a spousal hire. Even though universities like these try to put several people on tenure track to one tenured position, that was essentially irrelevant because Max was brilliant, and that was the whole reason Sloane had derailed her career for his. She's going to be an adjunct professor until she can earn her way to tenure track, despite the fact that her achievements are the same, if not more impressive than her husband's. So this university that she's had to move to accompany her husband, who's going to make lots more money now, has a very different set of philosophies, value system that it lives by. Namely, this university felt the value of their degree was reaped later, by design, like how artists necessarily had to starve. So this university likes to force adversity onto its student population, TA population, and professor population in the name of its exclusive status. The understanding is that because you've attended this university or associated with this university, you're going to reap the rewards later. You don't need to be paid today, despite the fact that you might need to eat today. Sloane has been asked to work on or even publish research by the end of the semester, which is ridiculous. The work of becoming inherently valuable, such that she might deserve job security, or even, dare she say it, some presumption of competency that was not derived from her husband's accolades. A semester is about 3 months long, so that's truly an impossible task. But if she's going to prove herself to the university that she doesn't have to just be a spousal hire riding on the coattails of Max's success, she has to find some sort of work to do. But she can't get her brain to work because she's recently given birth to a child. This brings us to Nina, our other protagonist, Nina Carr. She's a sophomore at the university, and it's relevant that she's a sophomore because she is rushing The House. This is a book about academia. It's also about Greek life, as much as it is about womanhood and sisterhood and girlhood and the patriarchy and all that other stuff. So it's relevant that she's a sophomore because sophomores don't usually get accepted into worthwhile Greek houses. And that matters because Nina is specifically rushing this year, not for any sorority, but because she wants to join the house. The reason that she's intent on joining the house is because something horrible has happened the previous year. It's left mostly undisclosed, but we sense that it's some sort of sexual assault. Nina feels undone. She feels something has derailed her life the previous year, and now she is forced to reinvent herself, to become something new, ultimately to become untouchable. She says the reason she's rushing the house is in order to win it all back. It being academic excellence, professional success, the ability to look at herself without a disemboweling sense of shame. To offset the previous year of her life, Nina needed to reach a better plane, a higher one. She was going to need the house. Among the house's recent alumni was a sitting governor, an Oscar-nominated actress, a Pulitzer-winning playwright, and an Olympic sprinter. Acceptance by the gatekeepers of social capital meant that even on an ugly day, a bad hair day, a bloated day, you were automatically more beautiful than the vast majority of your peers. Women are taught that beauty is power, and a lot of this book is going to explore whether or not that's true. Acceptance into the house will mean that Nina is superior to the previous version of her that was assaulted. This way, she can maintain some semblance of control over her reality. She's attempting to build an illusion of safety. Patriarchy teaches women that it's our responsibility. Their harm or the pain that befalls them is entirely their fault. That's why they ask what you were wearing when you were assaulted, because it's on you. So Nina has internalized this messaging and believes that if she can become a better version of herself, she can maintain control over her safety. It's a pathway to not just healing, but building an illusion of safety that will allow her to continue to participate in the bullshit system that she has to. So yes, joining the house will make her impervious to flaw, but ultimately it will allow her to maintain power and control over her life. Nina is a person with dreams and goals, like all humans, and she has ambitions to reach a top 20 law school. And that doesn't just mean academic success, but it also means having the right connections, because Nina Carr is the child of immigrants. She is not white. Nina has a twin named Jasleen, and she's very important. Jazz was a comparative literature major with a minor in gender studies, whereas Nina daydreamed on occasion about girls too, but she didn't announce it to the world. Jazz and Nina talk on the phone a lot. Jazz serves as a sort of literary device to allow, I think, Blake to parse out her ideas. Nina and Jazz serve as two sides of the same coin, one of which, Jazz's side, understands that sorority culture and Greek life is a system based in pretty extreme bigotry, exclusivity, and payment for power and connection in future, whereas Nina recognizes that that system's going to exist anyway, regardless of whether or not she participates in it. If she wants to financially take care of her parents, which is something that she believes she will need to do, particularly because Jazz has chosen a field where she's not going to make any money and thus will not be able to subsidize anyone's life, including her own. Nina says, it doesn't matter that I know it's wrong. It doesn't matter that I know that the system is fucked. In fact, knowing that the system is fucked is a reason that she has to participate in this way. So Jazz says a lot of things like, can't you just hang out with your friend without performing some kind of patronizing bonding ritual? Nina says, I've got to go. I've got to suckle the teat of white greatness. This brings us to recruitment. So apparently when you're rushing a sorority, there are a few rules and there are a lot of rules. While you're rushing, you're unable to participate in any drinking or party culture the first few weeks of school. This is one of the reasons that a lot of people trivialize Greek life, because you've just left your parents' house and you're now not supposed to have any rules, and you've immediately shoved your autonomy and your agency off to another enormous system that gets to tell you whether or not you're worthy. And more than that, the expectation is that she is dressed up, full face of makeup, hair always done, outfit ready, in class or outside of it. She says rush is fun, despite the fact that rush requirements were the opposite of fun and were, in fact, punishing. And Nina would have to come to class each day with her face and hair made up, operating under the watchful eye of every sorority girl on campus while pretending to be unaware this was the case. It was not unlike existing under the conditions of a debilitating crush and the expectation of, indeed hope for, unrelenting surveillance. We get the book from two perspectives, one from Nina, the sophomore at the university, and obviously one from Sloane, the adjunct professor. Sloane was also in Greek life when she was a university student, and she tells us, as a professor, as she's evaluating all of her students, she thinks it's interesting to see which of the students are wearing Greek letters. She says she supposed she did have a sense for which Greek letters represented beauty, sophistication, money. Admitting this to herself felt embarrassing and juvenile, but it was true. Because the truth is, inside of the Greek system, there is also a hierarchy, and some houses are more worth being in than others. She says sometimes she's surprised to see that some kids have rushed and others have not. She partitioned those sorts of associations into one of two categories: a try-hard mentality if the student in question was unattractive, or a victim of pathological groupthink if they were. Olivie Blake is a beautiful woman. All of this book is from the perspective of a beautiful woman, where a woman regarded as conventionally attractive in society. The book really opens on the first day of the semester when Sloane walks us through some of the perils of motherhood. Motherhood has resulted in the complete rearrangement of Sloane's life, as it will, as it should. She says when she gave birth to Isla, after the trauma of labor, Isla had begun to cry, and Sloane understood through an ineffable cosmic jolt that this was her life now. She also says that she likes motherhood a great deal more than she expected to, which felt a silly thing to say, given how miserable it often made her. Something that feels obvious, but that I'm going to say anyway, is that having a child isn't an addition to your main characterhood, right? It actively displaces you. You are no longer the main character in your life. It's a deprioritization of you as the main character, or of your husband as the main character if you haven't been able to deprogram yourself from the patriarchal and misogynistic bullshit that you grew up inside of. Sloane recognizes this, that Isla is now the center of her world. A lot of this book explores how men are not primed for this restructuring, for this reorganization. Thus, they don't expect to participate in it. I don't think her husband, Max, does not expect himself to become someone new, to change with the situation. He expects to maintain his personhood and doesn't recognize fatherhood as all-encompassing. Oftentimes, when she's looking at the young woman that she's teaching, she recognizes their beauty, their youth, and perfection as it relates to their skin and their intact perineums as something that she might feel jealous of, but ultimately doesn't, because as soon as she turned 30, she recognized that the clock doesn't stop ticking. Your life doesn't end when you turn 30 years old. In fact, you come to understand that your acceptance and your worth as a person is not something that you can defer to the men around you. It actually comes from within. She had grown into self-acceptance, which was functionally the disposal of deep-seated inadequacy. But she says with motherhood, all of a sudden, all of that self-confidence and understanding of self-worth really just fucking collapsed. Suddenly, with motherhood comes a whole new set of programmed bullshit to subvert, dodge, weave, cast off through people like, one, obviously Max, and her pediatrician, the other mothers around her, the people in your life, the things on television, the things inside the books. She felt a mix of longing and inadequacy, a desperation she hadn't felt since she was in her 20s, or maybe even earlier. To be good enough, not even better, but just the same. To keep up, that was it. Her pediatrician had given her a similar look when she'd confessed to struggling with sleep training. It was the look of a mother who had simply gotten over it. Had she considered simply being better at this? I want to talk about sleep training for a second, because sleep training is an idea made up by men. It became popular with the Industrial Revolution, when women were suddenly needed in the workforce. But for all of human history, babies have slept with their mother in order to maximize, one, the comfort of the baby, but also the rest of the mother. So you can do your own research on this if you want, but the person that I'm gonna hone in on is one Dr. Watson. Through science and logical reasoning, and probably stunted developmental issues that start with him probably hating his mom, I don't know, he insists that children shouldn't rely on the love and comfort of their parents. It shouldn't be something that they come to expect. He decides that he knows better than all of womankind and all of human history, and starts a generations-long shame fest, insisting that women don't instinctively know better than him, the behavioralist. He insists that babies should instead learn to self-soothe, that you should let the baby continue to cry in bed, so that it should not come to rely on someone answering its call. The implications of this are aplenty, because it means generations, us, you, me, and your parents, have all been robbed of the love that we were supposed to be given at birth. And if you want a real scare, go look up the fate of his children. Anyway, Max often says things like Isla's becoming easier with age, and Sloane doesn't totally understand that rhetoric. She says perhaps Isla's becoming easier for him, who had never been able to calm her without the use of one or both of Sloane's boobs. They talk about the way things work in their house and how when it comes to Isla, Max simply does not know how to do things. Something I want to mention is that Isla has a food aversion. And this is a problem because breast is apparently best until it's not. I think the use of Isla, a baby child who literally refuses to eat, is a really brilliant way for Blake to comment on disordered eating as a canon event for most women. She's just apathetic to food. Isla remained, how else to put this, sickeningly malnourished. She won't eat anything other than pasta, spaghetti bolognese, and it's something Sloane gets a lot of flack for from Max, who insists that this is a problem that they need to solve but does absolutely nothing to solve it. It doesn't seem to care about whether or not it gets particularly solved. I don't know actually that we see Isla and Max ever interact in the entire book. When Sloane returns to teaching and writing after the 1.5 years off, she drops Isla off at daycare, and it's a really agonizing process, of course, not just for Isla, but for Sloane. She drops her off with a frazzled Miss Lily, and Sloane is ruminating about the implications of this. She says Isla will forever understand that Sloane's love had limits, that Sloane had chosen work over her, that love itself was fleeting and could fail. Every time she tries to talk to Max about this, Max dismisses it and says, Isla's gonna adjust, don't worry, it'll be good for her. She says she's working very hard to circumvent the sense that needing to do her own work and fulfill her own desire for personal, intellectual, and adult satisfaction was more pressing than Isla's desire to read Trains for the 4th fucking time. As the days go on and Sloane has to keep dropping Isla off at daycare every goddamn morning, she asks Max to help her and he insists that he cannot. It's a flimsy excuse. It's not real. Eventually, Miss Lily reports back that Isla is really big on self-soothing. We obviously try to hug and kiss her, but she prefers to soothe herself. It's a good thing, she added, catching the dawn of apocalypse on Sloane's face. It's within the first week of school that Sloane meets Alex. Alex immediately offers Sloane understanding and community, something that she has not gotten from her husband. Whenever Sloane works to confide something in her husband, he can never empathize. He never understands, and he usually meets Sloane with some version of, that's your problem, in a pretty gentle way or an innocuous way, in a way that we as the reader, it doesn't make us think he's a bad guy. It just illuminates that he's a fucking guy. And so as soon as she has someone else in her life that can tell her that what she's feeling and thinking is normal, everything gets so much easier. With the rise of individualism in the world, we've really lost community, right? Like, it takes a village is not just a saying. Alex offers Sloane a faculty advisor position at the house, the same sorority that Nina is rushing, the most prestigious sorority on campus. The faculty women of the house have all previously been members of the house. Sloane is the only outsider coming into this situation. And what the house offers her is not just help with her kid, which definitely she does get, but acceptance, kindness, unconditional love, reassurance, things that ideally we would get inside of our marriages, but most of us don't. She also gets advice. There's no gatekeeping whatsoever. In fact, one of the really funny ways that Blake demonstrates this is every time Sloane says she really likes something, be it a recipe, a pair of shoes, a pair of pants, someone says, I'll send you the link. And they always do. In the 5 minutes she's been talking to this woman, Sloane suddenly felt like a person again, which she hadn't technically realized she still was. Because, right, that's not accidental phrasing, right? Patriarchy and misogyny teaches women to objectify themselves. I had coffee today with my friend Alex, Sloane imagined herself saying to Max. My friend Alex said she even liked the smell of her baby's farts. I told you it wasn't weird. Alex, who stood now in her office unexpectedly, holding a coffee that Sloane hadn't asked for, that she hadn't needed to request. And Sloane says, don't worry, it's decaf. Anticipation of needs. Women are taught to anticipate each other's needs and to be there for each other in a way that men simply do not know how. Alex and Sloane discuss the girls of the house that are rushing, Nina and Dalil being 2 members. And Alex says, honestly, I wish I'd been like that when I was their age. But the subliminal messaging in Teen Bop was, hate yourself, girl. And I was nothing if not diligent about it. When Sloane hangs out with the other women of the house, her child is taken care of in a way that she cannot trust Max to take care of it. Isla's butt had been slicked with the French diaper cream Sloane always used, but Max never did. He never goes the extra mile. And to call this the extra mile, right, is not true, right? Like, to say that the bare minimum is making sure there's not shit on your kid's ass. Okay, whatever. And now Isla was lurching her drunken sailor sprint across the living room to the twins with her hand in Brit's, and Sloane wasn't being crushed under the weight of existential dread. Because what Sloane is demonstrating for us here, what Blake is demonstrating for us here, is that it's not that when she drops Isla off at daycare that they're separated. It's that she can't trust other people to take care of her child and show her child the love that she would give her child. But when she's with the women of the house, she understands that Isla will be loved as if she is one of their own. The problem with men is they don't seem to even recognize their children as one of their own. The bystander effect. Okay, let's talk about Max. She says Max has always been hot. He's still hot, obviously. It was just nominally less arousing when he failed to accomplish certain tasks or suffered from the executive dysfunction he protested not to have. Sloane said she was always the good mother in waiting that was the good wife. When Sloane is contemplating taking on this faculty advisor position, which is she definitely wants to do, she wants the life-changing acceptance and friendship that these women are offering her, but she doesn't know if she has the time. Max says, I'll take Isla, breezily, as if it were no big deal, as if he took Isla all the time, as if he'd been clamoring for more time with Isla and his pleas had simply gone unheard. Max's happiness was dependent on breaks from his child that Sloane had never personally felt she needed. And when I'm reading and talking about Max, I feel a pretty specific rage. And that's because Max's life and this story between Max and Sloane is not an uncommon tale. So I feel rage on behalf of all women and children, but also rage on behalf of the male. The first victim of patriarchy is men who are taught to emotionally castrate themselves. I'm looking at you, dads. To repair the gap, do the work. Your relationship with your children, with your spouse, with your mother, and with yourself has been stolen by a system that schemes to pit you against your loved ones, that actually schemes to convince you that love is not worth anything. Compared to coin, you've been robbed. No one can get it back for you but you. Because I think what we're learning from the male loneliness epidemic is that women will be okay. Like any minority group that has faced adversity, we will find a way to change and adapt, and we will get our needs met. It's you guys that are falling behind, and no one can carry you the rest of the way. I promise it's worth it, but only you can do anything about it. So back to Sloane and Max. Sloane tells us more about her relationship with Max, and she says before she had Isla, she was very chill, a deeply cool girl. Sloane had slept naked every night because Max liked it, and the ecosystem of her vagina was of no relevant concern. In fact, she talks to us about their sex life, and she says that one night, after Isla has been born, she says to Max, why don't we have sex tonight, depending on how quickly Isla goes down. She says, you could would always be the one to put her down. Max laughed at her clever joke. When they do have sex, she says Max was adamant about prioritizing her pleasure, primarily in the sense that if he didn't bring her to the throes of ecstasy, he'd take it not as a personal failure from which to ambitiously learn, but as a disappointing turn of events. Anyway, she's talking about the differences in the way that they view their lives. It becomes clear to Sloane that if she doesn't put something on their family calendar, Max considers that time to be free space on the board rather than time that they as a family can hang out and bond, connect. Then she talks about how Alex is a single mother by design. Alex's desire was to focus on her child without simultaneously addressing a husband's dirty socks or his disinterest in family time. Before Sloane had understood in a visceral way that a man could be authentically progressive and fundamentally useless at the same time. There's a scene at the very beginning of the book when Sloane is trying to get Isla to eat anything, and Max is truly being entirely useless. She has to water down Isla's juice, and he says things like, "We really should just give her water," but she won't drink water. She's setting out dinner before the first day of school, and she's worried about going to the first day of school, and she puts down a fork in front of Isla, and Max says, "I guess Daddy isn't eating." Then he gets up and gets one fork, just one. Max also says things along the lines of, Crawford got me too'd. Crawford didn't get me too'd. He faced the consequences of his own actions, but the phrasing, Max's phrasing, implies a lot. Other instances of this come up inside the book when Isla starts waving to strangers, and Sloane says when people don't wave back, she wants to push them into traffic. And Max says, "You should check your violent urges." But when she confides the same thing in Alex says, "Yeah, of course. Of course. It's natural. Normal." "Babe, look," whispered Sloane urgently, hoping Max would see that Isla was singing to herself. "What?" said Max. Maybe it was only visible to Sloane, or maybe only Sloane ever cared. This brings us to the house. The house itself was Georgian. Brick with regal front columns, like a sex dream authored by Jane Austen herself on drugs. When we meet the women, the girls of the house, Nina regards them as the sleek orchestration of hunters in a pack. We come to find out that the house doesn't accept any legacies, despite the fact that they try. The house is in the position of championing women, exceptional women. Throughout a lot of the book, Nina and Sloane are both trying to figure out what it is about the house that makes the women that graduate from it so successful, incredibly successful. Sloane wonders if it really just is safe spaces, women championing each other, sisterhood. Nina meets Tessa and Fawn. Fawn is the president of the sorority. It's a really important job. A sorority president's job is basically to be the pinnacle of sisterhood. She doesn't have to be as pretty as the rush chairs or as organized as the VPs, but she can't have a single blemish on her reputation. Tessa is one of the only people of color in the house, and Nina asks her what it's like to be one of the only people of color. Tessa prompts Fawn. "I'm half, yeah," said Fawn, which was incredibly unclear to Nina. "I'm what the kids call white passing," which Tessa just loves to bring up. Fawn's general approach to academics implied some pressure from her parents, presumably not the white one. We learn that one of her parents is Filipino. A critical commonality, Asian parents. Tessa and Fawn explain the innate bigotry written into the Rush Bible, which there's particular hair rules, no natural hair, no dreads, no braids, but Fawn and Tessa took a red pen to the Rush Bible. We also learn that Tessa and Fawn think Alex is great and tends to go to bat with the university for the women in the house. It's very casually mentioned that Alex was instrumental in the disciplinary case that the college had launched against her. Against her? Can you believe it? Not the guy that roofied her? We also learned that at least one of the women in the house has been assaulted, and the university attempted to blame the girl assaulted rather than the guy who roofied her. Fawn and Tessa are talking to Nina about sisterhood, and they're saying things like it's for life. We learn that Fawn is an it girl, and the difference between a hot girl and an it girl is the ephemeral quality of making people either want you or want to be you, even against their will. Eventually, Nina starts referring to Fawn as her Rush crush. She becomes kind of obsessed with her. When you get obsessed with a girl, you want to be your friend, normal. In Nina's first day of class, she has a philosophy professor, Professor Villanueva. The professor strode in, an unusually handsome man who looked possibly Latino, maybe even an Asian mix, though either way, he had to be half. He was tall and lean, elegant, with artist's fingers, brown-black curls that all but begged to be touched, a dimple below the scruff on his cheek that was the precise size and shape of her pointer finger. When she locked eyes with him just then, she couldn't ever remember having seen a more arresting shade of green. So not only does Nina sort of have a crush on the sorority president, who she really wants to like her, and obviously Nina thinks her entire life depends on entrance into this very exclusive club that doesn't usually take sophomores, which she is. And she has a crush on her professor, who's super hot. This brings us to the country wife. The country wife is introduced to us through Sloane on her VidStar account, which parallels to TikTok in our universe. The country wife is run by a woman named Caroline Collins. She has 4 million followers on VidStar. And we also learn that she's the grand big of Fawn. So the country wife, Caroline Collins, has graduated from the house and the university and now is the epitome of trad wife lifestyle. The desire for tradition that was quietly synonymous with oppression. And she's making a living full time while pretending that what she's doing isn't a job. And there was no way that she had children, but how much longer could she hypothetically Madonna without becoming the whore? She says a lot of disgusting things. And Blake does a really good job of trying to make a case for the country wife. It's important that you know she's not just peddling like bread recipes and wearing lots of linen. She's also saying a lot of like conservative, bigoted shit. And we learn that Collins is her married name. Her maiden name is Pang. We get a conversation between Alex and Fawn wherein they're arguing. Fawn is going to bat for Caroline Collins because maybe she's her grand big. Fawn's protection of Caroline is actually one of the only things that we see her take a stand on throughout the entire book, and that will come up later. Fawn is insisting that they understand things like freedom of speech, and so if Caroline wants to come into the house as a former alumni and ask people to buy her book, that's very much her right. Alex thinks that that's a real problem because the things that Caroline is saying, the propaganda that she is touting to millions of people that will have very real impacts for the women of this house in the future, is super damaging and problematic and not something that they are willing to welcome into the house. So we get this argument about the freedom of speech versus are you allowed into this space, a space that's about free thinking, if you're going to say horrific shit. The betrayal that folks are feeling right now as our government officials or our powerful people become exposed, it's really only white people didn't see or understand the country and its toted principles as the lie and scam that they always have been. People of color have never been able to trust or rely on the protection of the systems that they pay into with their tax dollars, like education or law enforcement. That's what systemic racism is. This profitable nation is built on ground stolen from slaughtered indigenous people and built by slavery. People of color had to fight for their personhood over and over and over again for a very long time. It wasn't even 100 years ago that they were granted it. This country and the world is also built on the backs of women, their invisible and unpaid labor. It's white women that routinely and consistently seemingly forget this fact. White women continue to betray the movements that they need, often siding with their oppressor and voting against their own interests over and over again, each time they get the chance to vote, which hopefully we get to fucking keep it. So people of color have always been able to understand that they cannot trust the powers that be. And nobody else should either, including white men, but they're profiting more and they're being told that they're superior, and maybe that feels like enough. So they find a way to be comfortable inside of this nefarious fucking system. But anyway, Caroline Collins' trad wife, country wife account has a bunch of nonsense about traditional gender roles that conveniently forget things like women being historically barred from having their own bank accounts, that, you know, traditional gender roles was rooted in the corruption of evangelistic bigotry, white supremacy, and systemic power imbalances, a long storied tradition of institutional misuse, and declaring by virtue of God-given youth and beauty that women's work was something inherently profound. Sure, it was a lie, and the content was sponsored, but for the sweet love of fuck, the country wife's Sunday roast looked genuinely life-changing. Which brings us to part 2, education. So basically the point of the country wife, right, is ultimately the impossible task of womanhood under patriarchy. The country wife is pretending to offer women a way out of the patriarchal horribleness, heinousness, exhaustion by entering a cozy little cage and then subsequently tossing the fucking keys. What she's not saying is that she's offering you a different cage, and this one's significantly more permanent. But the truth is, there isn't a way out of patriarchy and misogyny, regardless of how much linen you fucking wear or bread you goddamn bake. The next time you see someone on your feed that tells you they are anti-feminist, in order to have a platform at all, you are standing on the shoulders of feminism. Probably if you're watching this video, you know that. It's not about baking bread. You can bake bread as much as you want. In fact, even the choice to be a stay stay-at-home mom and to engage with farm life or country life or whatever is about feminism. Just because you want to find a way to force your man to be a provider doesn't mean you should strip the rights of all the women around you. So under patriarchy, women are conditioned to dollhood. They're conditioned to objectification, to silence. Our male counterparts are similarly conditioned. Through media and literature and government, we become conditioned and accustomed to the male gaze, which is ultimately viewing life through the eyes of a man rather than through your own. And we begin to perceive ourselves as objects, which is why it feels so fucking impossible to be a good woman or a good mother or a good wife. We're not coming at it from a space of personhood, recognizing yourself as a person with identity and feelings. You are told that you are something that should be looked at and idealized rather than a legitimate human with, of course, flaws. You read enough Stephen King, gonna start thinking from the perspective of a Midwestern white guy, and you're gonna start to value the average-looking white guys and their feelings, their imagined feelings, over your own. Been there. So we have been taught that we are never good enough because patriarchy and misogyny understand that if it can preoccupy you with your own face and body, you won't be able to look outside of yourself. If it can convince you that the things coming out of your mouth are too loud and not right and need to be perfect in order to be allowed to take up any sort of space, you will spend the entire time working on things that aren't your growth and development. You'll spend your entire life attempting to be that object rather than getting to live. And the irony was that the whole time Sloane had been the best in her class or the prettiest or attracting the most envy from peers, from her friends, and from other women, she had still felt on the inside like she should have gotten that 1 point she'd missed, and she needed to lose 5 pounds, and she had to learn to fix every little flaw she'd always previously lived with. If she didn't, then Max would inevitably leave her because who could ever really see all her shit and still want to stay? She says she came to understand that the world didn't stop at 30, that maturity had only given her value rather than stripping it away, that her desirability to men had never offered her anything that actually mattered, even if it had felt like it at the time. This brings us to Arya, who is Dr. Hartley, Sloane's TA, and he is amazing. I might be missing something here because I really do think he's amazing. His description is his hand was warm and strong and his forearm was muscular and he smelled like fresh linen in a previous life. He's also a family friend to Jazz and Nina, so almost all of the characters of this book are connected so far. And we learn that Jazz has been obsessed with him since childhood and wants to date him. Arya's not really Jazz and Nina's cousin, but he's been raised as their cousin. So Arya has to sort of tolerate the objectification and sexualization from inside of his family. I think that's meant to call attention to the way that most of us have been sexualized by, the men in our extended or immediate families. And then we get this twice. We get this from 2 different men. When he learns that Sloane had been in a sorority and is now going to be a faculty advisor for one, he chuckled and said he hadn't thought her the sorority type. And while Sloane privately agreed, warily, she'd felt it was some subtle form of misogyny, as if he'd caught her reading a bodice ripper. Sloane is really attracted to her TA, Arya, and this is again that flip of, the teacher or the person in power that we typically hear about in most stories is a man being attracted to his child student. Arya is a lot older. He's not a teenager. He's not a student age. I think he's in his 30s or his late 20s. And he seems to care about Sloane in a way that Max really doesn't. He sees Sloane in a way that Max doesn't anymore, never has, I don't know. And after a particularly emotionally connected conversation with Arya, sex with Max that night was unusually good, apropos of nothing. And Max says, "Twice in 1 week. I must have been a very, very good boy." Disgusting. Okay, so Nina has been selected. She is now being initiated into the pledge class of the house. This is a really big deal, and they've chosen Nina and Dalil, the only other person, Nina's rush group. Dalil is in Sloane's sociology class, and we learn that she has ADHD. We also learned that the house was pretty on the fence about accepting Dalil. They don't know that she has ADHD, but they regard her as a quitter because she was a speech and debate champion and then nothing. She won a soccer championship and then nothing. All of her internships throughout her summers in high school were not connected. We understand this to be a symptom of ADHD, and I think personally quite impressive to be exceptional in all these areas, but it makes them think of her as a quitter, and Greek life is for life, so they don't know if they're going to accept her. Actually, Fawn and Tessa end up breaking Rush rules and calling Nina and asking her to vouch for Dalil, and Nina does, which is awesome. Sisterhood, love it. There's also something in Dalil's background that we don't come to find out until the very end of the book that leads them to be wary of her acceptance, and it's not just the fact that she's super adept in lots of different fields, and we'll talk about that later. So now that Nina is pledging the house, she says, "It was as if the impulse to seek attention had dimmed, a prior necessity transformed into an erstwhile symptom of cringe-inducing youth, the high of casual hookups now rendered cheap and fleeting. The gift of the house was the luxury of time and permission. Now, unlike before, Nina could wait. She could choose. Now, being in the house has given Nina a sense of superiority that leads her to not define her worth based on the men that she's around. Because the house is regarded as the most elite sorority on campus, she's regarded as one of the most elite women on campus, and is thus desirable, untouchable, powerful, in control by proxy." Alex is explaining the philosophy of the house to Sloane as they're discussing Caroline Collins, the trad wife, the country wife, and she says, "We want them to think for themselves, to feel that the world is theirs to conquer. The girls would eventually become good women, meaning in this instance, women who could do it all. What we do not want is for them to believe life would be easier if they no longer had any choices," which is the bullshit that Caroline is peddling. Because life doesn't get easier when you have no choices. And it's wonderful for Caroline, whose husband is maybe wealthy. The pledge class is asked to sit in a room together and confide all their deepest, darkest secrets. And one of the secrets that Nina actually says, she considers masturbation to be wrong or sinful, which I just think is an interesting kind of like untouched ad. Truly, Olivie Blake she's on another level. She is mother. So they're confessing their secrets, and Nina isn't really sure what to say. Someone confesses that they're bisexual, and someone else says, "So? I said the worst thing, not just a thing. Who in this day and age isn't bi?" scoffed Dalil. Me, says Maud. "I'm a lesbian." "Good for you, Maud. No reason to show off." And then they ask Nina why she waited till sophomore year to rush, and she said she actually wasn't interested in rushing her freshman year, but now she wanted something. The accountability to which none of her male peers were ever held. The things that had happened to her last year that wouldn't have happened if she'd been smarter, or of more value, or been part of an established, self-protecting group. "I want things to happen on my terms. I want it to be beautiful. No, I want it to be untouchable. I want it to count for more. I want it to be unbreakable, and I just wanted more power." Dalil cut in, breathless. The book does a really good job covering disordered eating as a canon event for women. Most of the women I know have had their disordered eating thoughts pushed upon them, yes, by the television shows we watched as children, by the clothing we were expected to fit into as children, but also by our mothers, because our mothers, existing inside of a system of misogyny and patriarchy, worked to try to protect us in the way that they knew how, and thus inflicted that shit, that toxic garbage shit, on us as a means to help us. So, now that they're in the pledge class, Nina is expected to attend these Monday night dinners. And at these dinners, everyone is eating ferociously. Over the course of Nina's friendship with other women, she had become accustomed to varying degrees of disordered eating. For girls to allow themselves sweets and fries and various other culinary misbehaviors, but only with a sense of guilt, and a collective understanding that it was sin-ridden in some way. She'd die before eating this way in front of a boy, and she had the feeling that most of the other girls would too. Wasn't this the benefit of feminine spaces? To exist in celebration, authentically, with no restraint? It wasn't just the food, but the freedom. Eating among women, unencumbered by shame, was actually the most delicious part of membership in the house. They get served this really decadent meal with lots of sauces and creams and meats and sweets, and they all encourage each other to shut up and eat, which is not a normal thing, no. She had never before asked herself who she was when she removed the mask of back-burning self-loathing and constant ritualistic assurance that it was not unpleasant or ugly, unfeminine, or otherwise barbaric in its celebration of itself. Snatch up her hand in gratitude for the freedom to be unladylike, to simply and wholly consume. It's in your oppressor's best interest for you to be weak and underfed and malnourished and tired and foggy. That's why they like it that way. So all of the standards that have been pushed on you, shoved down your throat since you were born, about skinniness and about thinness, they've been propagated to you by the men, the old men, that own these fucking companies. I always thought romanticized, high-minded starvation was a sort of rite of passage for the college years. Something going on in the background of all this womanhood is that Sloane has this deadline that is her research project that she needs to submit to the dean by the end of the semester. She wants to do the country wife as her project. She has connection to the country wife. She can go meet her. She now works with her sorority. And so she pitches the project to the dean, and what he says is, we're really looking for you to focus on something a bit more meaty, by which Sloane was almost 99% positive he meant men. And as Sloane keeps trying to convince him that maybe this actually is a worthwhile project by laying out literally the facts for him, Dean burns. This department has 2,000 followers on Instagram. This Christian girl trad wife has over 4 million across multiple platforms. Are you really telling me that your current faculty has more impact on society than this young woman? By the way, the Christian trad wife is 25 years old. She says, but in this neo-capitalist day and age, Sloane had unwisely postured, what is sociology if not an attempt to understand why something sells? She says, this girl has quantitative value, whether or not you find her to be intellectually stimulating or not. The country wife was objectively serious, not to mention extremely influential. Given the quagmirical popularity for conservative women, it was also a case study in femininity. Proof of several things. One, that good women instinctively exist, and that the good woman was effortless, and also that modern women, Sloane and her fellow whores, could no longer cultivate the divine feminine because they had been forced to seek some Western capitalist sense of meaning to only prove that they were worth a fraction of a man. It's true, right, that men who perform women tasks were paid well for it. Professional kitchens were run by men who had primarily learned from women. When women did it, it's arts and crafts. When men do it, it's engineering and architecture. But Burns' response to the movement the country wife belonged to could be taken as proof that feminine labor was always trivialized. Even though the country wife is a multi-million-dollar industry business, he's saying she's not important and it doesn't matter because she's a woman in linen. He says, the question we must ask ourselves, Sloane, is will this be a question of relevance in a few years? Sloane wanted to ask just how long Burns and his cohort plan to remain relevant themselves. So Sloane goes in again for facts. This is a very politically charged time as it relates to the rights of marginalized groups, which do in fact include women. I went to college in Iowa after attending high school in Nevada surrounded by Mormons. And when I got to Iowa and attempted to talk about some of the marginalization I was experiencing as a woman, I was met with literally the words, sweetheart, you've misunderstood the assignment. Women aren't a marginalized group. There are still people that live and die by the idea that women are not marginalized in this country or in the world, despite the unparalleled level of violence we experience at the hands of men and obviously the systemic oppression being perpetuated by us and them. She says reproductive rights, for example, right? You and I, if you have a uterus, you have lost rights under this current administration. You were born with more rights than you have right now. So the things being said online do have a very tangible impact on the lives of every woman in the country. But Dean Burns fails to recognize this because he's an idiot. I think that's what's so frustrating about entering the working world, is coming to realize that no, actually, the people around you didn't get to where they were necessarily contingent on their merit, and not everyone feels a responsibility to fact check the things they say out loud and to understand the impact that this is going to have on their lives and to understand consequences. So she says, Dean Burns, even if something is a trend, does that make it less significant? And Dean Burns says, I'm sure there's something there. As if Sloane merely thought a bit harder, she could find a man at the center of this thought experiment. Then Dean Burns says, by the way, how is Max? Sloane and Alex start to dovetail into conversations about the future being female and how that's a lie, and how in raising Isla, how can she tell Isla that she can dream and love and shoot for the stars when she's going to be met by closed doors simply because she's a woman? Like, in what way do girls rule the world? Be specific, because we can't even get our abusers to serve prison time. Our abusers, the people that run the prisons are abusers. Alex says, yeah, I know. The girls in the house, right? I tell them that in addition to a 4.0 and a great ass, they need a pitching wedge and a healthy tolerance for scotch. They are told their paths are infinite, but really they all boil down to these reductive little cults. And Sloane says, do you think the distinction cleaves around whether or not you have kids? And Alex says, nah, only in fiction. In reality, there's still Madonna mother and whore mother. It's this absolutely bizarre collective delusion where we buy shirts and maybe one white female CEO gets rich, but more likely it's a man. I get that any Democratic candidate is better than a Republican, but like how much better, you know? How long do we settle for equally warmongering but not actively a bigot? Sloane is trying to have this conversation with her husband, Max, the person who's supposed to be her partner, and he says, well, just remember, this isn't the best use of your time if Burns isn't interested in it. In further conversations with Burns, when she doesn't meet his deadline because she can't think of a research project that she wants to do that Burns also thinks is worthwhile, she explains that she's a mom. Dean Burns says, of course, Sloane, we understand that, but Max spends his time with other members of the department. And Sloane says, do you really think that contribution is worth becoming an absence in your own child's life? And he says, Sloane, please understand, when we're choosing tenured faculty members, we do have to consider whether they will put the university first. And she says, do you really want me to tell you that you're more important than my daughter? And he says, many members of our faculty are parents, Sloane. You're not the first woman to have a child. And she says, yeah, I won't mention that I'm also not the first woman to be passed over within the department as retaliation for having one. And then there's sort of a reckoning inside of the book where she recognizes that a good woman is just a good loser because there's no way to fucking win. The entire book is a philosophical and sociological conversation about womanhood and about how to engage with the world in a way that feels ethical and moral, not just according to your own standards, because probably if you're a woman, you haven't set your own standards, but the standards of the world around you. And so Jazz and Nina are having this conversation about whether or not beauty is a resource. Nina says, well, you say you can't understand why I'd join a sorority, but being in the sorority is exactly what gives me more of the social capital you seem to think all women lack. Right? Beauty was a resource, so was desire, so was a supply of premium booze. They have a conversation about privilege, and she says, hello, last I heard we share a DNA sequence, not to mention a tax bracket. If I'm privileged, you're privileged. And Jazz says, sure, but I'm not trying to ingratiate myself with that privilege. It's different. And Nina couldn't help herself. Look, the reality is that every douchebag at this school is using their privilege without a second thought, so why shouldn't I? And Jazz says, this is all very, I didn't think the leopards would eat my face, from the woman who voted for the leopards eating people's faces party. It was ironic in Nina's mind that there was no correct way to be a woman of color, just as there was no correct way to be a beautiful woman or a sexually active woman or just a woman, period. Her and Jazz continue talking, and Jazz, as she learns about the world, and Blake through Jazz. I think if you've read Olivie Blake's other books, which I have, I've read every single word that this woman's ever written, you understand that she writes from a space of truth, and it's quite courageous a lot of the time, and also revealing. One of the conclusions that is arrived at in this book is that when you look at the entirety of the picture, it's impossible to continue functioning. There's too much pain and too much suffering to find a point in the mess of violence. And so Jazz, who's meant to represent someone who is working towards moral superiority and ethical existence, says things like it's very unproductive to care this much and do nothing about it. And she says, my life is so easy and yet everything hurts. Nina says, have you considered going out and having a little treat, which is, the little treat culture, ways to continue moving forward. I don't think your existential suffering is doing anything specific for the Sudan. Nina is attempting to acquire power so that she can acquire capital, so that she can eventually, hopefully, affect change, not just for her family, but for anyone around her. Jasleen, who's devoted her life and her education to learning about the suffering of the world and working to eliminate adversity, will never have the capital to affect the change that she's devoted her life to. So the argument is kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them, maybe. Part 3. Initiation. Nina has a conversation with her professorial crush, Dr. Villanueva. He spots the Greek letters on her shirt and says, I never saw you as a sorority girl. She says she spots the hint of misogyny buried deep within the concept that a woman couldn't be beautiful and worth taking seriously at the same time. I take it you don't think much of sororities? Groundbreaking. Nina's voice was more dull than cold, but ultimately there was a dearth of flirtation. It was something about his behavior, his obvious desire to clutter up his tracks with misdirection that made Nina realize he actually wanted to fuck her. If it was a game he had played with every young woman in his classroom, then he wouldn't have bothered to end or conceal it. This was real. This was a man. It was repellent and also sexy in that by virtue of her awareness of his desire, he suddenly became the object. She says when it came to the house, it was difficult to predict where sex ended and power began. I am obviously a white woman. In that way, I cannot understand the adversity that women of color have faced and continue to face in today's society. And I also recognize that there must be pieces of this book, nuance, that I am definitely missing because I do not have the lived experience. I just don't want you to think that I don't know that. Because Nina and Tessa talk about code switching. Because it's not just womanhood that they feel they're betraying. They feel that they are betraying the adversity they've experienced as women of color. Tessa says, code switching gets me about this far. She says, at best, all I'm doing is dodging vitriol, because in the end, I'm still having to prove my worth to somebody who requires proof. Because if they were going to respect me or even see me as a person, they would have done it without needing fucking evidence. And that brings us to the big conversation about power. Sloane is talking about aging and about how there's a very palpable tipping point where becoming undesirable as a sexual object diminishes the mythology of your acceptance by men. Since that acceptance was a myth to begin with, the loss is actually imaginary, yet absolutely crushing at the same time. The problem is the patriarchy. The answer to literally every question is that of course we're being exploited. Of course we are. So what is power then? How as a woman do you acquire power? Was it the woman who used her desirability and the conventions set for her by the institutional penises that be? Was it simply to exist in the room? Because Alex, in her stewardship of the girls in the house, believes that it's their job to push the envelope forward, to get in the room and make change and make space for the women behind them, to let the ladder down. But what behavior did Alex expect from queer women, the women of color, the disabled women, the trans women? And that was not even to speak of unattractive women. God forbid. Was it power for Caroline Collins to have a significant, financially viable platform, even if the values her brand espoused were harmful and a betrayal to her kind? Was Alex's success, by the traditionally masculine markers, less significant than Caroline's success by the feminine ones? Was gendering power even a thing that could be done? Or was it already a failure because it was inherently buying into a system ruled by heteronormative cisgender men? Nina and Tessa and Fawn recognize Alex to be a sort of old guard, basic, more like a prom queen who keeps coming back for homecoming because she peaked a long time ago. But Nina recognizes there's something different than that, something older, an archetype, another archetype to the Madonna and horror archetypes discussed previously in the book. Someone whose power would inevitably be lost, worrying about whether her power was being lost. The house was both religion and spouse, institution and lover. After 6 weeks of pledging, Dalil and Nina and a few other pledges are initiated into the house. And that initiation ceremony looks like showing up in a white dress with no makeup on, as virginal as possible, and ultimately drinking blood from a cup without consenting to do so. And while Nina's talking about this, she says she misses the earnestness of girlhood, the playing of pretend, the enchantedness of magic and wilderness that isn't stolen from us but willingly released by us. Letting these things go so as not to be humiliated, caught in the act of wanting without moderation and restraint, caught in the act of playing and pretending and believing. The reason Nina has joined the house is for safety and protection. She's joining this pack, a powerful pack, that will hopefully keep her from future harm. Let there be safety in this house, she prayed, for she already knew there would be none outside of it. And after she drinks this blood, she's asked, doesn't it feel good, knowing that for once, you don't have to be the one to bleed. You're drinking this blood for every time you were called a bitch for saying no and a slut for saying yes. Peaceful protest only works if the enemy has a conscience. The night of initiation, Nina and Fawn consummate their relationship, and Fawn asks Nina to keep this between them. Another echo of a power dynamic. Fawn is the president of the sorority, and Nina a recently initiated pledge and a significant power differential. And Nina has been obsessed with Fawn since she met her, and the two of them have sex, and Fawn says, let's not tell anyone, because Fawn would get in trouble. Otherwise. Something else I should mention is that Nina suffers from endometriosis. If you look at these fucking risk factors, which is something that science has neglected to devote much of its time studying or attempting to devise cures for the pretty significant ailment that they pose for the women that experience it. But after she drinks the blood, her extreme pain diminishes, goes away entirely. Nina comes to find out, too, that Dalil, who's always struggled with ADHD, is now sailing through her homework, that all the women in the house suffer from no ailments, not even allergies. And if you know Olivie Blake, you know that there's magic in every single one of her books, not just in her written word, but in the plot as well. Alex's philosophy is that when women help women, we all win. But something that Nina recognizes is that Alex is not attempting to help all women. Alex is attempting to help a very exclusive subset of women that she considers elite and worth helping. nothing. Sloane tells us that she's just another girl that's been let down by men. That's what everything comes down to. And she's freaking out. She's pretty upset because she's raising a daughter in this world and she's not sure how to be honest with her daughter about the world that she's walking into. She can push her daughter toward acquiring resources, but those same people would still regard her as someone whose interests weren't serious, meaningful, or profound simply because she's a woman. It is revealed through conversation between Sloane and Max that he now believes, because he is bringing in more money, that Sloane actually owes him childcare, that he is not responsible for their daughter in the same way because he has more capital. She says that what she anecdotally observed to be true was actual concrete fact to him, that her absence was a burden while his was earned, that she as the mother owed more to Isla than he did. But she says Sloane's tolerance for hardships had always been so much higher. Yes, as a woman, particularly as a woman of color. Max has not had to shapeshift in the same way that she has. She says if something was a problem, Sloane simply fucking changed. When you grow up in this society, you recognize that the diagnosis is usually going to be that you're the problem. And so most groups of people that experience adversity recognize that they have to adapt and become better. They have to work twice as hard for half the credit. This actually makes us more threatening to the men around us, and they do more to oppress us, and we do more to fight back. So this brings us to Caroline fucking Collins. Sloane decides to go meet Caroline Collins, and she actually does this behind Alex's back, and she feels really bad about this because Alex and her have real trust between them in a way that Sloane's never had trust in her entire life. And of course, she comes to find that Caroline Collins' entire brand is fucking made up, obviously made up. She says, I've made over $1 million in sponsored content alone last year. I manage our finances and investments. So while she's peddling this idea that she is doing nothing but tending chickens and making bread, she is actually running a multi-million-dollar company. Caroline confirms that her audience is in fact young, impressionable women, give or take some horny incels and neo-fascists. And Sloane says, are you exploiting other women and profiting off their adoration while unknowingly contributing to a system that holds them back? Sloane says conservative women are arguably aligning with power that will only be used against them. Not arguably, definitely. And Caroline says, what do you think a good woman is? And Sloane hedges, right? That's what the entire book up until this point has been about. She says, I suppose it's kind of impossible to remove the constraints of the patriarchy from that question. But isn't it more of a question of who I wish I were, not what a good woman is generally? And Caroline says, why isn't your answer to what is a good woman a good person? I read that and I straight up had to put the book down. I was like, God damn it. Caroline Collins teaching us something. That sucks. And then, Caroline does her thing to justify her behavior. She says the truly unfeminist thing would be to devote my life to my husband without an audience so that only he benefited from the things that I know. Wife and mother are roles. Womanhood is intrinsic, not in the biological sense. I'm not a fucking Republican. And someone says you're an entry point to alt-right content and to the belief that what you do is what women are meant to do for men. Caroline says the women who believe this, they're going to believe anything they're told. And that's terrifying and true and also a product of our programming and socialization. Every piece of content that you consume that wasn't fucking bell hooks or the second sex has told you that that's your job. And if you're lucky, that messaging didn't come from inside the house, but it probably did. It probably came from your mom in an effort to protect you in a world that is very much against you, and it very much came from your father, probably, whether he intended to push this on you or not. So she says, I don't care if some fucking white woman in Omaha votes for a sex offender just because I gave her a recipe to make bread. And I just want to insert here, okay? Caroline is doing something right now. She is doing the Republican thing. She is downplaying what has actually gone on. Yes, of course, she peddles recipes that can make bread, but she's also saying you shouldn't have a job. She's saying it's better to not have choices. And that's not the same as peddling bread recipes. And Caroline says, if I don't wear the costume and say the lines, Karen and her friends decide I'm out here spreading China flu. Caroline leans in closer, a manic spark in her eye. Stop asking if I'm brainwashed and start considering why I might want people to think I am. Whether it's so dishonest that maybe it's a cover for something bigger or something worse. So Alex shows up to save the day because Alex mentored Caroline into what she is today, even though they don't have any of the same philosophies or agreements. And that conversation leads Caroline to disclose that the reason the women of the house and the girls of the house are so much more beautiful and that their lives are so effortless and they can think so quickly and they amass such incredible success is because they are eating men. And Sloane's pretty pissed. She's like, That's the literal secret? Cannibalism? And Sloane, is thinking about writing a book, like kind of fuck Dean Burns, right? She knows people in the publishing industry now, so she can get her book published with or without the department behind her. And she's thinking about writing a book, a sociological perspective of sorority culture. And she's like, okay, well, maybe I'll put this in my fucking book. And Alex says, well, if you make those kinds of claims, then it's a book that no one will publish because it's unequivocally absurd. Basically, who's going to believe you? So the book is brilliant, not just because the writing is really, really good, and not just because it's diving into enormous themes that a lot of us are grappling with today, but also because it has managed to insert the cliches and the typical narratives that we see between men and women or men in power into the relationships that we see in the book and make them more palatable for us. So it's not even until, the end of the book or the second reread that you're sort of slapped in the face with what you've just consumed. Oh my God, I didn't even get that until right. God damn it! And before you come at me, cannibalism in literature is typically a metaphor for, one, all-consuming love and intimacy, which is what Sloane's typically exploring with Isla and with all of the children that we see in the book. Total possession, obviously, is a reflection of rape culture. Devotion and sacrifice, what Nina feels toward the house, feels for the women around her, and what Sloane feels for Isla and family and children. Depravity of capitalism, doesn't need explaining. And nostalgia or memory. Something that's going on, one, because I think Blake is a self-insert for both Nina and Sloane at just various points in her life. Sloane comes to love Nina and all the girls of the house. She adores them the way a mother adores a child. She reflects on them as if they are, younger versions of her in a different time. Sloane comes home and she says she finds Max in the kitchen drinking coffee, the dishes from the breakfast he'd prepared for himself, just him, waiting patiently for someone's attention in the sink beside the unloaded dishwasher. It's an empty dishwasher. You should have to put it in the dishwasher. Why aren't you putting it in the dishwasher? And she says, is there any more oatmeal? And he says, oh no, sorry. Max says, how was dinner with your friend? And she says, it wasn't dinner with a friend. It's for the book I'm writing. The country wife. She's a cannibal. So is the whole sorority. And as she's reflecting on this, she's wondering what it means for her friendship with Alex, the person who she loves, the person who she trusts more than anyone else with her child and with her friendship. But she reflects on the way that Alex was sort of talking about Caroline. It was a little too doting, like a mother describing the bare accomplishments of her degenerate son. Max says, so she kills, and she says bad men. Violent sexual offenders are mainly her targets. Either way, it's some vigilante shit. Max does nothing with this information. Alex and Sloane again discuss womanhood. Alex points out that Sloane's husband is on tenure track, even though his record as an academic is barely even with hers. And she says, why are you the one staying home with Isla? Why didn't he want to stay home with Isla? Why didn't he fight you for the right to care for his child? He says, but what you contribute to the life and health of his child is worth less than his intellectual contribution to society. It's less important. Anyway, Alex says, are you going to turn me in? Why don't you just call the cops? And Sloane says, I don't trust cops. Most women understand that they can and probably will be taken advantage of by the people in positions of authority over them. Teachers, medical professionals, family members, and cops. Sloane goes and she tells Arya that the country wife is a cannibal. And they have a conversation about cannibalism and about right and wrong and about how there really are no cut and dry lines. She asks him if cannibalism is actually an ancient Egyptian practice. And he says, nah, that's just what medieval Europeans said to get away with it. And he says, a lot of places also acknowledge and legally define sorcery. It's one of those conversations that's hard to have, anthropologically speaking. Anyway, he can tell that Sloane is really struggling and that she does not want to go give this lecture, whatever intro to sociology lecture she's about to give. And so he takes the binder from her and he says, go get Isla. Go hang out with your kid. I'll handle your lecture today. And it's the only way that a man shows up and takes care of her in the book. Then we get the best night. I read this in the bath and I was cackling. Okay, so there's an invitational situation. Nina has asked Arya to accompany her as her date to some sort of formal with these frat guys. It's Malibu, Barbie, and Ken themed. And Nina actually tells us that she's bummed that there are going to be guys there because that means there's going to be all this performative bullshit. Arya shows up and he's gonna take Nina, and we know that Nina is pretty much in love with Fawn, and so she would never take, she doesn't actually have any interest in any of the men on campus, so she's taking her cousin for all intents and purposes, and she's trying to do her eyeliner, and he shows up and says, let me do it. I do a little calligraphy on the side, and my Etsy reviews are unparalleled. And Nina's roommate says, are you some kind of underwear model? Because he looks really hot in his Malibu Ken getup, and he says, close, I'm an underpaid TA. Across town, Sloane and Max are getting ready for a date night, and Sloane says she fought the reflexive grimace that came up with the thought of hyping herself up for sex, because after date night, there's always sex. The more time that passed since Alex's confession, the less Sloane really believed that the sorority are cannibals. So she asked Alex to babysit Isla, because regardless of the fact that she is a cannibal, she's the only person she trusts with her kid. While Sloane's getting ready, she comes downstairs, and Max and Alex are engaged in conversation, and she says she caught Alex's eye, and there was a moment, a little slip of pretense, where Sloane became aware that Alex was performing attentiveness, that actually Alex was incredibly bored and unimpressed, and Max couldn't tell. And Sloane says, what is perhaps the lowest moment of her life, she recognizes that she has married a man who didn't understand when a woman wasn't interested in what he was saying, and suddenly she wanted to stay behind. We move back to the party, the Malibu Ken party. Arya is dancing, and he's an absolute hit. He dances in the crowd by himself, and everyone loves him, including me. Fawn takes Nina into the bathroom and initiates like sexual relations with her, but also like blames Nina the whole time and is like, down girl. I don't know. It's kind of manipulative. And eventually, Nina and Fawn come outside. Who do they run into? But Professor Villanueva and his wife, Dr. Hartley, on a date. Professor Villanueva is Max. Oh my God. Can you believe that? So Sloane's husband, Max, the completely acceptable and totally normal, very common dad, is the professor that Nina is attracted to and that definitely wants to fuck Nina. So they all have this moment of confrontation, and clearly something passes between Max and Fawn. Something passes between Max and Nina. She knew, like glimpsing another life through a keyhole, that this was what she had narrowly avoided by saying yes to the house. A boring life, waiting in line for a restaurant, having nothing to say to a man who probably fucks his students. What's really cool to read about this is that we get inside of the minds of both of these women, and so we know that Sloane has been idealizing the women on the board of the house and also the girls of the house, and we see here Nina idealize Sloane. She seemed like someone who probably knew what a good wine was and how to wash delicate fabrics and why that coat fit her so perfectly, like a glove. And then Arya, looking for Nina, comes out of the club and says, I asked the other Barbies where you were, and then he sees Sloane, who he clearly has a crush on. Oh, Sloane, Arya said as if he couldn't help himself. Arya? Dr. Hartley replied in a low, amused voice. I don't usually refer to women as Barbies. After this awkward interaction ends, and we get this big reveal as the reader that Professor Villanueva is actually Max. Max and Sloane are driving home, and Sloane says, they look like children, you know? Like little girls. And Max says, I guess. Because he doesn't think they look like little girls. He thinks they look like sex objects. Part 5. Dinner. Part 5 opens with Nina evaluating Professor Villanueva, aka Max, the average man, the common man, the father. And the reason she's evaluating him is, one, because he's currently giving a lecture on hedonism, also because Fawn has pitched him as the candidate for dinner. I'll get there in a second. What Nina has come to know through her relationship with Fawn is that the sorority eats one man a year. They all bring a candidate that they think would be good for eating. And I'm going to get to the specifics of that in a second. But Fawn thinks that Nina should bring Professor Villanueva because it's clear that he's definitely attracted to his student and probably would engage in some sort of like extramarital affair relationship with her, which makes him a predator. Thereby, you know, the vigilantism that is the undercurrent of the house's cannibalism would make him a satisfactory choice. Nina found Professor Villanueva's lecture on hedonism to be something of a letdown. She had believed him to be an enigmatic intellectual who did not belong to a class of people who farts. After spotting her crush in the wild, she's been disenchanted by who he might be. Nina hated to continue learning from a man who'd already revealed himself to be nothing more than a man, and she's trying to figure out, is there really a metric for who deserves to be fed and who deserves to be eaten? Nina had told Fawn that it just seems like there might be someone more deserving of the slaughter, like a white guy. And Fawn says there's some parity here as it relates to quality of exchange, meaning you probably don't want to eat a white guy because you're not going to get as much from him. We also learn, right, that once the girls graduate from the sorority, they no longer get to participate in the man-eating dinners. So Caroline Collins, what she's doing and the way that she's managed to amass this success is by continuing her vigilantism. She's on her own as it relates to finding and eating men. Nina's chewing on all of this, and she says Jazz's understanding of the world as an unwinnable place that cannibalized itself inherently. Women who vote for men, who strip the rights of women, striving emptily for the intangibles of purpose and meaning while half the world clawed for the basic right to be alive and starve. Really staring into the face of the problem and looking at it from all angles. It wasn't possible to be ethical or to be happy, and yet it was also completely unethical to be miserable, given the circumstances of her life. And she also recognizes that apathy is not something that's just going to die out. A lot of us, myself included, are waiting for the generation of boomers that built their lives and their extreme wealth on social services that they then immediately dismantled, are waiting for them to die out so we can have some of the land and the cash back. But you can't okay boomer your way out of the entire world's injustices, because the truth is, as angry as I am with them, fish shaking isn't necessarily getting us anywhere, and they're not responsible for all of the suffering and all of the problems, just ours. Nina actually spots Alex and Sloane walking by, and she idolizes the two of them, these women that she hopes to be like one day. Alex herself is a lawyer, and Nina aspires to practice law. She sees the two of them together, and I believe Alex is a white woman, and she feels something like frustration, or the feeling when you're having sex you didn't really want to have, which is just so fucking sad, right? Because you know exactly what feeling I'm talking about. She says, so yes, Alex represents her champion right now, someone who wants Nina to succeed, but wouldn't bat an eye if Jazz were starving. That'll come up later. And she says Dr. Hartley, Sloane, she wasn't quite that, but her husband is Dr. Villanueva. And didn't that have to mean something? She had chosen a man who was likely a predator, or was it just that she had chosen a man?
Did I forget to tell you that Sloane sleeps with Arya? Sloane sleeps with Arya. They have an affair.
We learned that the first ritual, that the house didn't always cannibalize people and didn't earn like magic health and wealth through this practice. It wasn't intrinsic to the house. It actually started with Alex, who accidentally killed the guy that roofied her. And Nina says that was it, this hum, the frequency that she always feels inside the house, the power emanating from the house, the waiting, the unsprung coil that she can always feel when she walks inside. It's that all these women have been wronged. Someone who hadn't accepted the word no, someone else who had never even asked permission. She couldn't tell if that was true of every room full of women or if it was specific to the house. They each had a starting point, then a definite end point of the girlhood they'd all endlessly fought to win back. Nina's was last year. So anyway, hedonism. Professor Villanueva didn't seem to understand it, but he taught Nina something about it all the same. Sloane is thinking of Isla and how she is going to be horrifically fucked one day in a way that Sloane could predict but not prevent. And if she was lucky, Isla would know sex before love, but statistically, the odds were stacked against her. Sloane and Max are inside their house, and Sloane discloses that Dean Burns says that they're going to move Sloane down to part-time adjunct because she hasn't come up with a research project that Dean Burns approves of. And that means that Sloane's going to lose her health care and access to the university daycare. And Max says, I told you not to piss off Dean Burns. Max, it appeared, was frustrated with her. And then Max says he would actually like to take a sabbatical to work on his book. And Sloane says it was like the other shoe had finally dropped. Did you have sex with a student? Did she report you, or did you get caught? Sabbatical, please. Not a chance that was his choice. She wonders if she can trust her husband a little bit or even at all. The fact that Sloane trusted a bunch of fucking cannibals to take better care of Isla than her child's own father says a lot. And she feels a mortification over being the kind of woman who'd followed right into the every woman trap. She says, Max, who are you fucking? Max had said something about not being able to reason with her, and then he'd left to go to work, getting blown by some pretty teenager who didn't yet have crow's feet or a fucking sense of solidarity to her kind. And then Sloane apologizes and she says she knows it's not the kid's fault. Sloane, misreading the conversation between Nina, Max, and Fawn, believes that Nina is the student that Max is having sex with. She's not. She thinks, I guess I could leave him. She says I could go it alone, like Alex, who might be a cannibal, but who's also a really good mom. Couldn't a person be two things without one contradicting the other? And she says perhaps this is what it means to be a woman. You're a woman, and it's your job to make everything easier for everyone around you, even though nobody will ever think of you. You're a woman, and it's your job to make sure your children love their father and never know what a fucking idiot he is. You're a woman, and it's your job to have it all, but never complain about how heavy it is to carry. You're a woman, and you are put here to suffer and feel pain, or so people will say, and so they will act, and so you will never be properly treated. You're a woman, and so the transgressions against you will always be justified, and you will always be blamed. You're a woman. A woman knows that the game is rigged, and a woman knows that she's playing to lose. From catcalls at 12 to a life built on the razor edge of predation and exploitation, confusion about whether the desire of others was good or bad, a reward or a punishment. She existed in all the bodies of all the girls girls who didn't yet see that they could no longer trust the intentions of their teachers. This world that wanted her to suffer, all because a woman in a story ate an apple in a garden, because a woman somewhere got hungry, because a girl could starve and nobody would care, but a woman had to eat. A good woman didn't devour. A good woman left things intact. A good woman didn't leave things as she found them. She made them better. She was deserving of love not because she was beautiful. She was beautiful because she shone from within. With her worth, Sloane flees to Carolyn Collins' house to get some answers. It seems that Carolyn actually loves her husband, and Carolyn says, is it really that shameful for you to admit that you're in love with the man you married? And Carolyn says, I don't find it shameful. I just don't expect it to last. And Sloane says, for a long time, I didn't expect Max to love me forever. It seemed like maybe he'd love me more, I guess, if I just became everything he needed. If I took better care of him than me. But in doing that, I taught him exactly how to neglect me. Sloane says, I can't give her this world. I can't give this world to my kid. The world where you fall in love and he fucks a teenager. Or teenagers, fucking plural. And then Carolyn, the vigilante alt-right cannibal, feeds Sloane, and Alex shows up and they mother her and they nurture her and they take care of her. There's this conversation in the middle of like this world falling apart where Sloane says, is there miso in here? And Carolyn says, yes. Wow, I definitely thought you were too white to notice. And she says, Britt sent me a link to the miso carbonara. She looks at Alex and she says, you're the only person I trust, and I know I called you an insane fucking cannibal, and that's still true. But it doesn't matter, I love you so much. And Sloane says, I do not know what to do. And Alex says, you're gonna raise her to be strong, and you're gonna catch her when she falls. Carolyn confides in Sloane that the dinner, the eating of the man, cannot come from a place of hatred. If you want it to give you something back, it's a communion. You have to love the food. So, Fawn, as the president of the sorority, announces that they will be having a dinner at the end of the semester. And for those of you who are new to the matter of dinner, you are each asked to present a candidate on the evening of the feast. We must protect the sisterhood as well as nourish it. We do not only eat, we also decide. We learn that the quality of the candidate does impact the results of the meal, and, more than that, you must love the object of the dish. After this conversation, Tessa confides in Nina that Fawn is not going to win the presidency next year. Fawn is a junior, because no one in the house feels particularly supported by Fawn. And in fact, the only thing she's ever taken a stand on is Carolyn fucking Collins being allowed to preach her toxic bullshit. And the world sort of crumbles down around Nina for a second, or the house crumbles down around Nina for a second, because she's like, wait a second, do you not all believe in sisterhood? And they basically say no. They're going to slate Nina for presidency so someone else can run against Fawn. And Nina does not want presidency, one, because she's in love with Fawn and this feels like an enormous betrayal to her friend, and two, because now she's learning that everything that was touted while she was pledging and rushing, the people around her don't seem to buy. And Tessa says, you know, you actually should be president because you still believe in the sisterhood, even though it lied to your fucking face. Nina goes immediately to Fawn to tell her what happened. Fawn turns on Nina really quickly and says she's basically just been using her for sex. We come to understand that Fawn actually also is into Max and is the student that Max is being put on sabbatical for sleeping with. We also learn that the reason the house didn't want Dalil is because someone had filmed revenge porn of Dalil and released it. Dalil is 18 years old, so that's child pornography. But Fawn says it doesn't matter, it's leverage for someone else to use. And Nina feels a deep, profound sadness that made her wish that she'd given Dalil an extra beat of kindness the last time they hugged, because everybody blames the woman. And Fawn says, you know what? The real betrayals don't come from the men, because at least their reasoning is selfish and logical. They can't stand us because we're a threat. But it's our friends, Nina, our fucking sisters, that stab us in the back. And that's kind of rich, right? Because Fawn is empty words, and she's wishy-washy, and she's flimsy, and she's using Nina for sex to make sure that she's not a threat to the professor that she's actually interested in. And Nina is confused because she hadn't promised fidelity until cancellation, until indignity or disagreement or betrayal. She had promised until death. And so she confides in Dalil, and she says, you believe in it, right? Sisterhood. God, yeah, says Dalil. And this is when we get to the end of the book. All of the girls have brought their candidates, who are immediately sedated. Dr. Villanueva shows up and was surveying the sea of guests, observing them with a brutal sense of suspicion, perhaps that all was not quite right. I think this is meant to echo the way that any girl has ever felt walking into a frat house, maybe? I don't know. Fawn confides in Nina that the worst part about her relations with Dr. Villanueva is that she didn't even get the highest grade in the class. He gave it to some dude named Brody. Nina tells Fawn that she loves her, and Fawn says, bummer. The house was holy. The house was violent. This leads Nina to do something drastic. She stands up in front of the house and she presents her candidate. Well, something else that's been going on throughout the book is that some of the girls don't want to eat men. They want to eat women because they know that that would result in them getting better results. She says, my candidate is myself. I love you, she said to her sisters. This much. Nina, Dalil whispers, in reverence, in awe. Nina says, what had any of them ever wanted but love? They don't eat Nina. Nina actually is elected president. She becomes Lady Superior. And the guy that they do eat was one of the sisters' boyfriends. Turns out he wasn't a Kennedy, but a Carnegie. And another two sides of the same coin. Jazz had come to visit Nina at school, though their paths never crossed. And Sloane had come to love Nina by proxy, through stories that Arya has told, and through the belief that Nina is sleeping with her husband. She ends up kidnapping Jazz, who's in front of the sorority house, mistakenly thinking she is Nina, and she eats her, fulfilling Nina's prophecy, her intuition, that women like Alex and Sloane might root for Nina, but they'll do what it takes to look out for their own. They don't extend their care to women like Jazz. They steal Jazz's life. They trade Jazz's life for Isla's. Because men will do what men do, and that's goddamn boring. We expect it. We train for it. We wait for it our entire lives, waiting for the violence of men from birth. And sure, there are betrayals in the form of fucking trad wives and in white women that call themselves allies but then say that politics don't impact them. But this betrayal comes from inside the house. I don't want the end of this video to be eat or be eaten, but I think the point that Blake is making is that you can't look at the sum, the whole puzzle, and find something innately good or gorgeous or peaceful. You have to build the peace inside of yourself. It can't be prescribed by the house or by your parents or by the government or by your education system. You have to build it, and you have to decide what you can live with and can't live with. Write down what you think your values are, then evaluate your life and write down what it looks like your values are based on where you spend your time. So Blake's point might be that it's an insidious system, but we are of a different generation. A generation that seems to understand our oneness in a more complete way, more than our mothers did. And maybe we'll do it differently, or maybe we won't. The only thing that changes the system is the threat to the system itself. My name is Sage. Thanks for watching. Next time. It smells like burnt hair.